A poor black farmer risked his life to drag a stranger out of a burning car, but when he turned around, his entire cornfield, his only way to pay off his debts and send his daughter to college, had already gone up in flames. Even in the midst of panic and heartbreak, he still brought the injured stranger home, bandaged him up and let him stay the night, leaving the whole neighborhood stunned. But the very next day, trouble hit hard. The bank showed up to seize his farm, and the stranger had completely disappeared. Just when he thought his life was over, 10 black SUVs suddenly came speeding down his dirt road, leaving him frozen in shock. Before we continue, tell us what time it is and where you're watching from. Subscribe and hype, because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The morning sun was already brutal by 10 o'clock, turning the Kansas dirt into something close to concrete and making the air above Marcus Hill's cornfield shimmer like water. He was kneeling beside the irrigation pump at the eastern edge of his property, wrench in hand, trying to coax a few more months of life out of equipment that should have been replaced 2 years ago. The pump coughed and sputtered, leaking water from a crack in the housing that Marcus had patched 3 times already. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and muttered a curse under his breath. A new pump would cost close to $2,000, money he absolutely did not have, not with Alicia's acceptance letter to Columbia University sitting on the kitchen table like a beautiful, impossible dream. Marcus was 41 years old, a black man with shoulders still broad from decades of farm work and hands so calloused they barely felt the heat of the metal wrench anymore. His wife Sarah had been gone for 3 years now, taken by cancer that had burned through their savings faster than it burned through her body, and he'd been raising their daughter alone ever since, trying to keep the 20-hectare corn farm profitable enough to cover the basics: food, electricity, the mortgage payment to Frank Doyle's bank that hung over everything like a storm cloud that never quite broke. The corn was good this year though. Marcus straightened up and looked out over the field, rows of green stalks standing tall and healthy in the merciless sun. If the weather held, if prices stayed steady, if nothing catastrophic happened, this harvest would be enough. Just barely enough to make the mortgage payment, cover Alicia's first semester tuition, and maybe, if he was very careful, put a little aside for emergencies. It was a lot of ifs. He was tightening the last bolt on the pump housing when he heard it. The high-pitched scream of tires losing traction, the mechanical shriek of brakes that weren't catching, and then a sound like the world splitting open. Marcus dropped his wrench and ran. He sprinted through the corn rows, his boots pounding the hard earth, his heart already hammering because he just knew that whatever had happened was bad. The sound had come from the access road that bordered the southern edge of his property, where the black top curved sharply, and drivers unfamiliar with the area often took the turn too fast. When he broke through the last row of corn, his stomach dropped. A red sports car, sleek and expensive looking, had left the road entirely and plowed straight into his field. It had cut a destructive path through at least 30 yards of corn before the front end crumpled against the harder packed earth. The hood was buckled upward, steam hissing from the ruined engine, and as Marcus watched in horror, he saw the first flicker of flame underneath the chassis. Inside the car, visible through the spider-webbed windshield, was a man slumped over the steering wheel. Blood ran down the side of his face from a gash near his temple. Marcus didn't hesitate. He didn't think about the corn getting crushed, or the lawsuit that might follow, or any of the 100 practical concerns that would have been reasonable to consider. He just ran toward the burning car. The driver's side door was jammed. Marcus yanked on it twice before giving up and looking around wildly for something, anything. He spotted a rock the size of his fist half buried in the dirt, grabbed it, and slammed it into the driver's side window. The glass shattered on the second hit, and Marcus reached through, ignoring the cuts opening on his forearm, fumbling for the door release. The door groaned open. The man inside was young, maybe 30, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, breathing but unconscious. Marcus unclicked the seatbelt and hauled the man out, draping him over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. The man was heavier than he looked, dead weight, and Marcus's legs burned as he stumbled backward, away from the car. He made it maybe 20 yards before the gas tank exploded. The blast wave hit Marcus from behind, hot and violent, and he threw himself forward over the unconscious man, shielding him with his own body as burning debris rained down around them. A piece of flaming metal landed in the corn 3 feet away, and within seconds the dry stalks caught fire. Marcus watched, his heart sinking into his boots, as flames raced through his field. The corn was tinder dry from weeks of heat, and the fire spread with terrifying speed, jumping from row to row, consuming everything. He could already see that he was going to lose at least a third of the field, maybe more, and with it any hope of making the mortgage payment, or sending Alicia to college in the fall. But the man on the ground beside him was breathing. That was something. Marcus felt his chest tighten, felt something that might have been tears or might have been just sweat burning in his eyes, and he made himself look away from the burning field. He bent down, hoisted the stranger onto his shoulders again, and started walking toward the house. Behind him, everything he'd worked for turned to ash and smoke, but his hands stayed steady and his steps stayed sure, because saving a life, he told himself, saving a life was more important than corn. It had to be. By the time Marcus got the stranger back to the house and laid him on the living room couch, the man was starting to stir. Marcus called the local doctor, old Dr. Patterson, who'd delivered Alicia 17 years ago, and the doctor arrived 20 minutes later in his pickup truck, black bag in hand. Patterson examined the stranger carefully, checking his pupils, testing his reflexes, cleaning and bandaging the head wound. "Concussion," he said finally. "Probably moderate. He needs to stay still for at least 3 days longer if symptoms persist. Watch for vomiting, confusion, severe headache. If any of that happens, you call me immediately, and we'll get him to the hospital in Wichita." "He can stay here," Marcus heard himself say. Patterson looked at him over his glasses. "You sure about that, Marcus? You don't know this man." "I pulled him out of a burning car, can't very well leave him in a ditch now." The doctor nodded slowly. "All right, I'll check on him tomorrow. And Marcus, that was a good thing you did. A brave thing." After Patterson left, Marcus sat in the kitchen and let himself feel it, the full weight of what had just happened, what he'd just lost. Alicia was at the library in town, studying for her SATs, even though she'd already been accepted to Columbia, because that's who she was. She didn't know yet. He'd have to tell her when she got home that their plans, their careful calculations, had just gone up in smoke. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the kitchen table, an old wooden thing with water stains and knife marks, and made himself breathe. The man on the couch groaned softly. Marcus stood and walked back to the living room. The stranger's eyes were open now, confused and unfocused. He blinked several times, trying to orient himself, his hand moving instinctively toward the bandage on his head. "Easy," Marcus said, his voice gentle. "You were in a car accident. You hit your head pretty good. Doctor says you need to rest." The man stared at him. "What happened?" "Your car went off the road, crashed into my cornfield. I pulled you out before it exploded." Understanding dawned slowly in the man's eyes, followed immediately by horror. "Your field? Oh God, did I?" "It caught fire," Marcus said simply. "Burned about a third of it, before we could get it under control. But you're alive, and that's what matters." The stranger looked like he might be sick. "I am so sorry, I don't even remember what happened. The road just turned and I couldn't." He stopped, pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes. "I'll pay for the damages, whatever it costs, insurance, or out of pocket, whatever you need. Let's worry about that later. Right now, you need to rest. What's your name?" "Marcus Hill." "And you are?" The man hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Nathan Cole." Marcus nodded and went to get Nathan some water and something for the pain. When he came back, Nathan was staring at the ceiling, his face pale and drawn. "The doctor says you should stay here for a few days," Marcus said, handing him the water and pills. "Make sure that concussion doesn't get worse. Guest room's just down the hall. I can't impose, you already crashed into my field. Might as well stay and make sure you don't die on my couch. Would be terrible paperwork." Nathan managed a weak smile. He took the pills and drank the water slowly, then lay back against the cushions. Within minutes he was asleep. Marcus stood looking down at him for a long moment. The stranger was young, probably not even 35, with the kind of clean-shaven, well-groomed appearance that suggested money. The jeans were expensive despite being casual, and the watch on his wrist, even scratched from the crash, looked like it cost more than Marcus made in a year. Rich kid, probably. Someone's son out for a drive through the countryside, not paying attention, not understanding that a moment of carelessness could destroy someone's entire livelihood. Marcus felt a flash of anger, hot and bitter, but he pushed it down. The man hadn't meant to crash. It was an accident, and Marcus had made his choice when he ran toward that burning car instead of trying to save his crops. He'd just have to live with the consequences. Nathan Cole woke the next morning with a headache that felt like someone had driven a spike through his skull. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was or how he'd gotten there, and then it all came rushing back. The curve in the road appearing too fast, the steering wheel jerking uselessly in his hands, the sickening crunch of impact. And then nothing until waking up on a stranger's couch with a bandaged head and the knowledge that he'd destroyed someone's livelihood. He sat up slowly, testing his balance. The room tilted slightly but steadied. He was in a small living room with worn furniture that looked like it had been collected over decades from yard sales and hand-me-downs. Everything was old but clean, maintained with obvious care despite limited resources. The walls showed water stains in the corners, and the floorboards creaked when he stood. But there was something warm about the space that Nathan's expensive penthouse in Chicago had never managed to achieve. On the mantel above a small fireplace sat a framed photograph. Marcus, looking younger and less worn, standing beside a beautiful black woman with kind eyes, both of them with their arms around a little girl with bright ribbons in her hair. The woman in the photo was gone now. Nathan could tell from the way the photo sat alone, from the faint layer of dust that suggested it wasn't moved or cleaned as often as things that were still part of daily life. Nathan walked slowly to the kitchen, following the smell of coffee. Marcus was at the stove, scrambling eggs in a cast-iron pan, and he glanced over when Nathan appeared in the doorway. "Morning. How's the head?" "Hurts, but I'll live, thanks to you." Marcus just nodded and gestured to the table. "Sit. Doctor said you need to eat." Nathan sat at the small kitchen table, and Marcus set a plate in front of him. Eggs, toast, a slice of tomato, simple food, but prepared with care. Nathan ate slowly, partly because his stomach was still unsettled from the concussion, and partly because he was trying to figure out what to say, how to begin apologizing for the damage he'd caused. Before he could speak, the front door opened and a young woman walked in, carrying a backpack and a stack of library books. She was 17 or 18, tall and pretty with her father's eyes and her mother's smile, and she stopped short when she saw Nathan at the kitchen table. "Dad, who's this?" "This is Nathan Cole," Marcus said. "He's the one who crashed into the south field yesterday. He's going to be staying with us for a few days while he recovers." "Nathan, this is my daughter Alicia." "Hi," Alicia said cautiously, setting her books on the counter. Then processing what her father had said, "Wait, the crash. How bad is the field?" Marcus's expression didn't change, but Nathan saw something flicker in his eyes. "About a third of it burned. Maybe a little more." Alicia's face went pale. She looked at her father, then at Nathan, then back at her father. "Dad, we'll figure it out," Marcus said firmly, the kind of tone that meant the conversation was over. But Nathan had seen the look that passed between them, had seen Alicia's stricken expression before she got it under control, and he understood immediately that the damage he'd caused wasn't just to crops, it was to plans, to futures, to careful calculations that didn't have room for error. Over the next 3 days, as Nathan recovered under Dr. Patterson's cautious supervision, he observed the Hill household with growing fascination and something that felt uncomfortably like envy. They were poor. That was obvious from the patched furniture and the careful way they managed every resource. But they had something Nathan hadn't experienced since he was very young, maybe not even then. They had warmth. Marcus and Alicia moved around each other with easy affection, communicating in shorthand developed over years of being the only family each other had. They made dinner together, washed dishes while talking about Alicia's college plans, sat on the porch in the evening, listening to crickets and not needing to fill the silence with empty words. Nathan found himself drawn to it the way a person who'd been in the cold too long was drawn to fire. He learned that Alicia had gotten into Columbia University on her own merit, had taught herself advanced calculus from YouTube videos, and wanted to study biomedical engineering so she could design affordable prosthetics for people who couldn't pay for expensive medical devices. He learned that Marcus woke at 5 every morning and didn't stop working until after sunset, that he'd been running this farm alone since his wife died, and that he had the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving things that would have broken most people. And Nathan, despite the headache and the guilt and the knowledge that he'd be leaving soon, found himself not wanting to go. On the third evening, Alicia was making dinner while Nathan sat at the kitchen table, supposedly resting, but actually helping her peel potatoes. Marcus was outside dealing with something in the barn, and Alicia had been chattering about her college orientation materials when she suddenly went quiet. "Can I ask you something?" she said, not looking up from the onion she was chopping. "Sure. Do you have family? Like people waiting for you to get home?" Nathan's hands stilled. The question was innocent, just a teenager making conversation, but it hit him harder than he expected. "No," he said after a moment. "Not really. No wife or girlfriend. No." "What about parents? Siblings?" Nathan set down the potato peeler carefully. "My parents divorced when I was 10. Dad remarried, moved to California, started a new family. We don't really talk. Mom died 2 years ago, cancer, and I'm an only child." Alicia finally looked up, her eyes soft with sympathy. "I'm sorry. That must be lonely." "It is," Nathan admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "Very lonely." They worked in silence for a minute, and then Alicia said quietly, "My mom died 3 years ago, same thing, cancer. It was awful watching her get sicker, and knowing we couldn't afford the treatments that might have helped. That's why I want to design medical equipment, so maybe other families won't have to choose between bankruptcy and fighting for someone's life." Nathan felt something crack in his chest. "That's a good reason. A really good reason. Dad doesn't talk about her much. I think it hurts too much. But I see him sometimes, late at night, just standing in the kitchen looking at her photo, and I wish I could make it better somehow." "You do make it better," Nathan said, "just by being here, by being his daughter. That matters more than you probably realize." Alicia smiled at him, and it was so genuine and warm that Nathan had to look away, had to focus on the potato in his hands because the alternative was acknowledging how much he wished someone would smile at him like that, like he was family, like he belonged. That night, lying in the guest room that had probably been Alicia's mother's sewing room or office before she got sick, Nathan stared at the ceiling and admitted something to himself that he'd been avoiding for 3 days. He didn't want to leave this house. Not because of gratitude or obligation, or even guilt about the cornfield, though those were all real enough. He didn't want to leave, because for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt like he was somewhere that mattered, with people who saw him as a person rather than a bank account or a business opportunity. It scared him how much he wanted to stay. It scared him how right it felt to sit at that kitchen table, to help Alicia with her homework, to talk with Marcus about crop rotation and irrigation systems. He was 30 years old, had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, owned a penthouse that overlooked Lake Michigan, and had been featured in architecture magazines, and what he wanted more than anything was to stay in this old farmhouse with its creaking floors and leaking roof. Nathan pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes and made himself face the truth. He was falling for this family. Not romantically. Alicia was young enough to be his daughter, and Marcus was grieving his wife, but falling nonetheless. Falling into the fantasy that he could belong here, that he could be part of something warm and real instead of returning to his empty apartment and his lonely life. And that fantasy, Nathan knew from hard experience, was dangerous. Because every time he'd let himself want something like this, every time he'd reached for connection and warmth and family, it had been taken away. His mother leaving, his father moving on, friends who disappeared when the money dried up during rough business years, a girlfriend who'd left him when she realized his wealth couldn't fill the emotional void where a functional human being should have been. Better to leave now, before he got too attached, before he started believing this could be something permanent. In the morning, Nathan would go. He'd leave money to cover the damages, as much as Marcus would accept, and then he'd return to Chicago and his real life, and this strange interlude in Kansas would become just a story he told at dinner parties, about the time he crashed his car into a cornfield. That was the plan. But plans, Nathan was learning, had a way of falling apart in the face of human need. Frank Doyle heard about the fire before Marcus had even finished putting it out. News traveled fast in small towns, and bad news traveled faster, and by the time Frank climbed into his truck and headed out to the hill farm, he was already calculating how to turn this catastrophe to his advantage. Frank was 53 years old, heavy through the middle, with a face that had settled into permanent dissatisfaction somewhere around his 40th birthday. He'd managed the First National Bank branch in town for the past 15 years, and in that time he'd foreclosed on 8 properties, including 2 that had belonged to people he'd gone to high school with. He didn't enjoy it, exactly, but he didn't lose sleep over it either. Business was business, and Marcus Hill owed him $18,462.17. Frank pulled up to the farmhouse just after breakfast on the 4th morning of Nathan's stay. He climbed out of his truck, hitching up his pants, and walked to the front door without bothering to knock first. Marcus was at the kitchen sink, washing dishes, and he tensed when he saw Frank through the window. Nathan, sitting at the table with coffee and the local newspaper, caught the change in Marcus's posture immediately. "Problem?" Nathan asked quietly. "That's Frank Doyle. He holds my mortgage." Marcus dried his hands on a dish towel and went to open the door. "Frank, what can I do for you?" Frank pushed past him into the house, his eyes sweeping the room with practiced assessment before landing on Nathan. "Heard you had some excitement out here. Whole field burned up, from what I understand." "About a third of it," Marcus said evenly. "A third?" Frank whistled low. "That's gonna make it tough to come up with your payment next month, isn't it?" "I'll manage, will you?" Frank pulled a folder from under his arm and dropped it on the kitchen table. "Because I've been looking at your account, Marcus, and you've been just barely scraping by for the past 3 years. One bad season and you're done. And now you've had a bad season." Nathan watched Marcus's jaw tighten, watched his hands curl into fists at his sides. "I said I'll manage," Marcus repeated, his voice harder now. Frank opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "Your payment is due in 10 days. $18,462.17. You got that kind of money lying around?" "Not yet, but the rest of the field is still good. When it comes in won't matter if you can't make the payment on time." "That's what due date means, Marcus. You're either on time or you're in default." Frank leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "Course if you can't pay, I'll have to start foreclosure proceedings. Bank policy, nothing personal." "The hell it's not personal," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you? Waiting for any excuse to take this land." "I don't need to wait for excuses. You're poor, Marcus. You've been poor since your wife died and left you with all those medical bills. You were barely hanging on before the fire. Now," he shook his head, "you're dreaming if you think you can still send that girl of yours to college. Maybe it's time you faced reality." Nathan saw Marcus take a step toward Frank, saw the violence coiling in his shoulders, and stood up quickly. "Mr. Doyle," Frank turned to him, eyes narrowing. "And who the hell are you?" "A friend." "Friend?" Frank's lip curled. "You the one who crashed that fancy car into his field. Bet you feel real guilty about it. Guilty enough to help old Marcus out with his money problems?" Nathan opened his mouth to say yes, he absolutely would help, but Marcus cut him off. "We don't need your charity," Marcus said, his voice sharp. "Either of you. I'll figure this out on my own." "Marcus," Nathan started. "I said no." Marcus turned to face him, and his expression was harder than Nathan had seen it. "I appreciate you wanting to help, but I don't take handouts. Never have. Not going to start now." Frank laughed, a harsh sound, still so proud. "You know what your problem is, Marcus. You think being poor is noble. You think suffering makes you better than people who actually have money. Well, newsflash, it doesn't. It just makes you poor, and in 10 days it's gonna make you homeless too." He gathered up his papers and headed for the door, pausing to look back. 10 days, Marcus. Then this place is mine." After Frank left, the kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Marcus stood with his back to Nathan, his shoulders rigid, and Nathan could practically feel the shame and anger radiating off him in waves. "Marcus," Nathan said carefully, "let me help. I have money, more than enough to cover your mortgage, and then some. It would be nothing to me. That's exactly why I can't take it." Marcus turned around, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Because it would be nothing to you. A rounding error, but for me, it would mean I saved your life because I expected to get paid for it. It would make me someone who does good things for profit instead of because they're right. That's not how I'd see it, but it's how I'd see it, and I have to live with myself, Nathan. That's all I've got left, my self-respect. Take that away and what am I?" Nathan wanted to argue, wanted to point out that self-respect didn't pay mortgages or send daughters to college, but he could see in Marcus's face that this wasn't a rational position. It was something deeper, more fundamental, a man drawing a line and refusing to cross it even if it cost him everything. It was infuriating and admirable in equal measure. From the doorway, Alicia's voice was small and broken. "Dad?" They both turned. She was standing there with tears running down her face, and Nathan realized she'd heard everything. "Dad, if I just defer for a year." "No," Marcus said immediately. "Absolutely not, but I could work, save up." "You're going to college, Alicia. That's not negotiable." He crossed to her and pulled her into a hug. "We'll figure this out, I promise. Your mama made me promise I'd get you there, and I'm keeping that promise." Nathan watched them, father and daughter, holding each other against the weight of impossible circumstances, and felt something twist in his chest. This was what he'd been watching for the past 3 days, this fierce love and commitment that didn't depend on money or circumstances or anything external. This was family in the truest sense, and he had destroyed it. Nathan set his coffee cup down carefully on the table. "I should go," he said. "The doctor cleared me yesterday. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Marcus pulled back from Alicia, wiping his eyes quickly. "You sure you're okay to travel?" "I'm fine, and I've already caused you enough trouble." Marcus started, but Nathan was already moving toward the guest room to gather his few belongings. 20 minutes later, Nathan's rental car, delivered by the insurance company the day before, was loaded with his things. He stood in the driveway with Marcus and Alicia, the morning sun already hot on his shoulders, and felt like he was making a terrible mistake but couldn't see any other choice. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for saving my life, for taking care of me, for showing me what real integrity looks like." Marcus shook his hand. "You take care of yourself." Alicia hugged him, fierce and quick. "Goodbye, Nathan." "Goodbye." Nathan got in the car and drove away, watching them in the rearview mirror. Marcus with his arm around his daughter's shoulders, both of them standing in front of their small farmhouse, facing a future that looked increasingly impossible, and he made it exactly 3 miles down the road before he had to pull over because he couldn't see through his tears. He sat there on the shoulder of a Kansas County road, his hands gripping the steering wheel, and finally let himself feel the full weight of what he was running from, the first place he'd felt like he belonged in 20 years. The first people who'd seen him as something other than his net worth. The first real family, even borrowed and temporary, that he'd known since his mother died. He was 30 years old, worth somewhere north of $500 million, and he was running away from the only thing that had made him feel like a human being instead of a bank account because he was too scared to let himself want it. Nathan pulled out his phone and stared at it for a long time. Then he made a call to his lawyer, and another to his accountant, and a third to someone he'd done business with in Kansas City. By the time he was done, he had a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it might blow up in his face, but it was better than driving back to Chicago and spending the rest of his life wondering what might have been. He checked his mirrors, pulled back onto the road, and headed not north toward home but south toward the county records office. There was work to do, and only 10 days to do it. Marcus stood in his driveway for a long time after Nathan's rental car disappeared down the road, his arms still around Alicia's shoulders. Neither of them spoke. There wasn't much to say that wouldn't make things worse. Finally Alicia pulled away. "I need to go study, baby girl." "I'm fine, Dad." "Really?" But her voice was thick, and she disappeared into the house before Marcus could see if she was crying. Marcus walked out to the burned section of the field. The fire department had contained it before it spread beyond about 8 acres, but 8 acres of mature corn was roughly a third of what he'd been counting on for harvest. He ran the numbers in his head for the 100th time. Even if the remaining field produced at the high end of projections, even if he sold it all at premium prices, he'd be short about $6,000. $6,000 might as well be $6 million for all the chance he had of coming up with it in 10 days. He thought about calling his brother in Missouri, but they hadn't spoken in 5 years after an argument about money. He thought about asking the church for help, but they were already struggling to keep the lights on. He thought about taking out a payday loan, but the interest rates were predatory and would just dig him deeper. Every path he considered led to the same place, losing the farm. That night, Marcus lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house creak and settle around him. In the room down the hall he could hear Alicia moving around, probably unable to sleep either. 3 years he'd managed to keep things together after Sarah died. 3 years of working himself half to death, of careful budgeting and constant worry, and it was all going to fall apart anyway. He thought about Nathan's offer to help and felt a fresh surge of anger at himself for refusing. Pride was expensive apparently, too expensive, but he couldn't shake the feeling that taking Nathan's money would have changed something fundamental about who Marcus was. He'd pulled that man from a burning car because it was right, not because he expected payment. The moment he accepted money for it, retroactively or otherwise, it became a transaction. And Marcus Hill didn't sell his decency, even if his decency cost him everything. A week passed, then 8 days, then 9. Marcus worked the remaining field like a man possessed, doing everything he could to maximize what was left. He called every buyer he knew, negotiating for the best prices. He sold off equipment he might need later, old tools and spare parts, anything that might bring in a few extra dollars. It wasn't enough, it was never going to be enough. On the 9th night, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with all the bills spread out in front of him, the final accounting of his failure. Alicia was in her room with the door closed. He could hear her crying softly, trying to muffle the sound so he wouldn't hear. That was the worst part. Not his own failure, but the fact that his daughter was in there trying not to cry because she didn't want to make him feel worse. Marcus put his head in his hands and let himself feel it, all the grief and fear and exhaustion he'd been holding back for days. He thought about Sarah, wished more than anything that she was here to tell him what to do. She'd always been better at this, better at seeing solutions when all he could see were walls. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty kitchen, to her ghost or memory or whatever remained. "I tried, I swear I tried." The house was silent except for the ticking clock and Alicia's muffled crying. Tomorrow Frank would come. Tomorrow Marcus would have to admit defeat. Tomorrow he'd start making calls about where they could stay, what he could afford for rent, how they'd manage with no assets and no prospects. Tomorrow everything changed. Marcus gathered up the bills, put them back in their folder and went to bed. But sleep didn't come, and he lay there in the darkness trying to figure out how to tell his daughter that her mother's dream for her was dead, and it was his fault for not being strong enough or smart enough or lucky enough to save it. Nathan Cole's penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan from the 43rd floor, all glass and steel and carefully curated modern art. It had been featured in Architectural Digest, and people who saw it always said the same thing: it was stunning, beautiful, a masterpiece of urban living. Nathan had never told any of them that he hated it. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows on his first night back from Kansas, looking out at the city lights spread below him like scattered diamonds, and felt the familiar emptiness settle over him like a weighted blanket. The penthouse was 5,000 square feet of luxury, and every inch of it felt cold and dead and wrong. There was no warmth here, no lived-in comfort, just expensive furniture arranged by an interior designer and cleaned twice weekly by a service Nathan never met face to face. The refrigerator was stocked by a meal prep company. His mail was sorted by his assistant. His dry cleaning appeared in his closet like magic. He lived like a ghost in his own life. Nathan walked away from the windows and into his home office, a room dominated by a desk that cost more than Marcus Hill's truck. On the desk was a photograph in an expensive frame, the only truly personal item in the entire penthouse. Nathan at 8 years old, standing between his parents at some long ago Christmas. His father had his arm around his mother's waist, and she was smiling at the camera, and Nathan was grinning with the gap-toothed joy of a child who still believed his family was permanent. The photo had been taken 6 months before everything fell apart. Nathan picked it up, studying the faces of people he barely recognized. His father was probably in California right now with his second wife and their 2 kids, children Nathan had never met and probably never would. His mother was in a cemetery in Connecticut, buried next to grandparents Nathan had never known because she'd been estranged from her own family when she died. He'd been at a business conference in Singapore when he got the call. Cancer, they'd said, very aggressive, she'd fought hard but there was nothing more they could do. By the time he got a flight back she'd been dead for 36 hours. He'd stood at her funeral with a handful of her friends and neighbors, none of whom he recognized, and realized he'd become so absorbed in building his company and making his fortune that he'd forgotten to have a family. Or maybe he'd never had one to forget. His parents' marriage had been toxic from his earliest memories: his father's affairs, his mother's rage, the screaming fights that sent young Nathan hiding in his closet with his hands over his ears. When they finally divorced, it was almost a relief. Except his father moved across the country and his mother sank into a depression that lasted years, and Nathan learned early that the word family didn't necessarily mean love or safety or permanence. By the time he was 18, he'd been living in boarding schools and summer programs for so long that institutional living felt more natural than having a home. By the time he was 25, he'd made his first million and realized that money could buy him everything except the thing he actually wanted: to matter to someone. To have someone care whether he came home at night or not. His last serious relationship had ended 3 years ago when Jessica finally admitted that she'd fallen in love with his lifestyle, not with him, and honestly couldn't tell the difference anymore. He'd wanted to be angry, but she was right. He'd been so focused on building the business, on achieving the next milestone, that he'd forgotten to be a person someone could actually love. And now he was 30 years old, absurdly successful, and so lonely it felt like a physical ache. Sitting in Marcus Hill's kitchen, helping Alicia peel potatoes while Marcus told stories about Sarah, Nathan had felt something he'd almost forgotten existed: the simple pleasure of being part of something. Of belonging somewhere to someone, in a way that had nothing to do with what he could buy or build or achieve. For 3 days he'd been part of a family, and then he'd run away from it because he was terrified that if he let himself want it too much, losing it would destroy him. Nathan set the photo down and pulled out his phone. He had work to do, calls to make, plans to execute. In 9 hours, Frank Doyle would show up at the Hill farm to foreclose on the mortgage, and Nathan needed everything in place before that happened. He just hoped Marcus wouldn't hate him for what he was about to do. Frank Doyle arrived at exactly 9 in the morning, right on schedule, carrying a folder of foreclosure documents and wearing his most businesslike expression. He'd been looking forward to this for 3 years, ever since Marcus's father died and left the farm to his son, and he wasn't about to let sympathy or sentiment get in the way now. Marcus was waiting for him on the porch, Alicia standing beside him with red-rimmed eyes and her jaw set with the kind of stubborn pride Frank recognized from her father. They knew what was coming. They'd had 10 days to prepare for it. Frank climbed the porch steps, already reaching for the documents. "Morning, Marcus. I assume you know why I'm here." "I do, and I assume you don't have the $18,462.17 you owe the bank." Marcus's hands clenched at his sides. "Not yet. But if you could give me until the harvest comes in, we've been over this. The payment was due yesterday. You're in default. Now I'm not completely heartless," though his tone suggested otherwise, "so I'm giving you 30 days to vacate the property." "That's more than generous, considering what?" The voice came from behind Frank, and he turned to see Nathan Cole walking up the driveway from a black SUV Frank hadn't even heard pull up. "Considering you've been waiting years for an excuse to kick a good man off his land. Considering you're about to make a family homeless over $18,000. Frank's eyes narrowed. "This is between me and Marcus, Mr. Cole. It doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does concern me." Nathan climbed the porch steps, and there was something different about him today. He wasn't dressed in the casual clothes Frank remembered from 10 days ago. Today he wore slacks and a button-down shirt, expensive but understated, and carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that came from being used to getting his way. "Because I own that debt now." Frank blinked. "What?" Nathan pulled out his own folder and handed several documents to Frank. 3 days ago, I contacted First National's regional office in Wichita. I made them an offer to purchase Marcus Hill's mortgage note at a premium. They accepted. As of yesterday afternoon, Marcus's debt is owed to me, not to your bank." Frank stared at the documents, his face going red. "You can't do that." "I can, and I did. It's a standard financial transaction. Banks sell mortgages all the time. You'd know that if you were better at your job. So what, you're going to foreclose instead?" "That's even worse. I'm not foreclosing. I'm forgiving the debt." Nathan turned to Marcus, who looked like he'd been hit with a brick. "The mortgage is paid off. The land is yours, free and clear. I've also arranged for a contractor to repair the irrigation system and replace the damaged corn with a late-season variety that should still give you a partial harvest this year." Marcus couldn't speak. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again, and nothing came out. Frank found his voice first. "This is insane. You're just going to hand him $18,000. I'm paying for the damages my car accident caused." The field that burned represented roughly 30% of his expected harvest. At market prices, that's about $22,000 in lost revenue. I'm covering that loss. It's not charity, it's compensation for damages. That doesn't. Frank sputtered, but there was nothing he could say. The documents in his hand were legitimate, properly executed, and absolutely legal. The debt was gone. Nathan turned back to Marcus and Alicia. I've also arranged for a small scholarship through my company's foundation. It'll cover about half of Alicia's first-year tuition at Columbia. Not everything, but hopefully enough that with the harvest money and maybe a part-time job, she can make it work. Alicia made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Marcus still couldn't speak. Frank crumpled the foreclosure papers in his fist. This is ridiculous. You people think you can just, but he didn't finish the sentence. He just turned and stalked back to his truck, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. After he drove away, the three of them stood on the porch in silence. Finally, Marcus found his voice. Why? Nathan met his eyes. Because you saved my life. Because you did it without expecting anything in return. Because I watched you choose to do the right thing even when it cost you everything, and I realized I've spent 30 years trying to fill an empty place inside me with money and success when what I actually needed was to learn how to be decent, like you. But this much is nothing to me. Nathan held up his hand before Marcus could protest. I know you don't want to hear that. I know it makes you uncomfortable that what feels like a miracle to you barely registers as an expense to me. But that's the reality. I have more money than I know what to do with, and most of it just sits there making me feel more empty and useless. At least this way, it does something good, something real. I can't accept charity. It's not charity, it's restitution. My car destroyed your field, I'm paying for the damage. That's how responsibility works. Marcus shook his head slowly. You're twisting things around to make me feel better about taking your money. Maybe, but you saved my life, Marcus. You risked everything to pull me out of that car, and you didn't even know who I was. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How special? Nathan's voice cracked. I've met 1,000 people who'd claim to be good, who'd talk about integrity and values, and 90% of them would have stood there calculating whether saving me was worth the cost to their field. But you didn't hesitate. You just ran toward danger because someone needed help. He paused, collecting himself. That meant something to me. It changed something in me. So please, let me do this. Let me be part of something good for once in my life, instead of just another rich guy making money off other people's work. Marcus looked at Alicia, who was crying openly now. Then he looked back at Nathan, and something in his expression softened. On one condition, name it. You come back. Not just once to check on things. I mean really come back. Have dinner with us. Let Alicia teach you how to make her mama's cornbread recipe. Sit on the porch and drink sweet tea and talk about nothing important. Be part of this. He gestured at the house, the land, the life they'd built. Because if you're going to save my family, the least I can do is let you be part of it. Nathan felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked tight for so long he'd forgotten it was there. I'd like that, he managed to say. I'd like that a lot. Alicia crossed the distance between them and hugged him, fierce and tight, and Marcus followed, wrapping his arms around both of them, and the three of them stood there on that porch holding each other while the Kansas sun beat down, and somewhere in the field the corn grew and life went on, just a little bit better than it had been before. True to his word, Nathan came back, not just once but regularly. At first it was once a month, flying in on Friday evenings and leaving Sunday afternoons. Then it was every other week. Then as summer turned to fall and Alicia prepared to leave for college, he started coming almost every weekend. He told himself it was to check on the farm, to make sure the repairs were progressing smoothly and the late-season corn was growing properly. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. He came back because the hill farm was the only place he felt like himself. They fell into an easy rhythm. Nathan would arrive Friday evening, and Marcus would have dinner waiting, something simple, usually, because Marcus wasn't much of a cook, but made with care. They'd eat together at the kitchen table, talking about the farm, and Nathan's work, and Alicia's preparation for college. After dinner, they'd sit on the porch watching the sun set over the cornfield, and Nathan would feel the tension of his Chicago life slowly draining away. Saturdays, Nathan helped with whatever work needed doing. He wasn't much use at first. 30 years of desk work hadn't prepared him for manual labor, but he learned. Marcus taught him how to check the irrigation lines, how to identify pest damage in corn leaves, how to operate the old tractor that Marcus used for hauling equipment. Nathan's hands blistered, then Call used. His back ached. He'd never been happier. One Saturday afternoon in late July, they were in the kitchen preparing dinner together. Marcus had declared that Nathan needed to learn to cook properly, and Alicia was supervising the lesson with obvious amusement. Nathan was attempting to dice vegetables for a stew, concentrating hard on keeping his fingers out of the way of the knife. "You're holding it wrong," Alicia said, trying not to laugh. "You're supposed to hear, let me show you." She took his hands and repositioned them, demonstrating the proper technique. "See, you curl your fingers like this so you can't cut yourself." "Got it," Nathan said, trying again. The knife slipped, missing the carrot entirely and putting a shallow cut across the tip of his thumb. "Ow, damn it." "Language," Marcus said automatically, but he was smiling as he handed Nathan a paper towel. "You're hopeless in the kitchen." "I'm aware." Nathan wrapped the paper towel around his thumb, feeling oddly pleased despite the minor injury. When was the last time someone had corrected his language? When was the last time someone had cared enough to teach him something, to tease him about being bad at it, to hand him a paper towel without making it feel like a failure? Alicia took over the chopping while Marcus stirred the pot on the stove, and Nathan stood there watching them move around each other with practiced ease, and felt that by now familiar ache of wanting to belong to this, to be part of their rhythm instead of just a visitor passing through. "What?" Alicia asked, catching him staring. "Nothing. Just, this is nice." Marcus glanced over from the stove. "What is this?" "Cooking together. Being here." Nathan hesitated, then said what he'd been thinking for weeks. "I never had this growing up. Family dinners, people teaching me things, that feeling of being." He trailed off, not sure how to finish. "Home?" Marcus supplied quietly. "Yeah, home." There was a moment of silence, and then Marcus turned off the stove and came over to where Nathan was standing. He looked Nathan in the eye. "Serious now, you are home, son. You know that, right? This isn't you visiting. This is you being part of our family." Nathan's throat tightened. "Marcus, I mean it. You saved my life just as much as I saved yours. Maybe more. This farm, this life, my daughter getting to go to college, none of that happens without you. So stop thinking of yourself as a guest. Your family." "Your family," Alicia echoed, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "That's what you are, whether you believe it or not." Nathan couldn't speak. He just nodded, blinking hard, and went back to very badly cutting vegetables while Marcus and Alicia pretended not to notice he was crying. That evening, after dinner was eaten and the dishes were washed, the three of them sat on the porch watching fireflies drift across the darkening field. Nathan was in the middle, Alicia on his left, and Marcus on his right, and there was something perfect about the symmetry of it, about being flanked by the two people who'd somehow become his family. "Can I ask you something?" Alicia said into the comfortable silence. "Sure." "Why don't you ever talk about your family? Your real family, I mean, your parents?" Nathan had known this question would come eventually. Alicia was too smart and too curious not to notice the gaps in his stories. He'd been preparing an answer for weeks, something vague and deflecting, but sitting here on this porch with these people who'd seen him at his worst, and chosen to keep him anyway, he found he didn't want to lie. "There's not much to talk about," he said finally. "My parents' marriage was bad from the start. I don't have many memories of them being happy together. Mostly I remember them fighting. My dad cheating, my mom crying or yelling or both. When I was 10, they divorced, and Dad moved to California, started over, got remarried, had more kids, the whole thing." "Did you ever visit him?" "A few times. It was awkward. His new wife didn't really know what to do with me, and my half-siblings were so much younger that we didn't have anything in common. Eventually I just stopped going. It was easier." "What about your mom?" Alicia asked softly. "She tried. I think she really did, but she was so angry about the divorce, about being left, about having to raise me alone. She wasn't great at hiding it. By the time I was 12, I was in boarding school. By 15, I was spending summers at academic programs instead of coming home. It wasn't that we didn't love each other, exactly, we just didn't know how to be around each other." Marcus's voice was gentle. "When did she pass?" 2 years ago. Cancer, very aggressive.
I was in Singapore when it happened, and by the time I got back, she was already gone. Nathan stared out at the fireflies. The worst part was realizing I'd been so busy building my company that I'd barely talked to her for months. I thought there'd be time. There's always supposed to be time. I'm sorry, Alicia said. She reached over and took his hand, squeezing it. That must have been really hard. It was. But honestly, the hardest part was standing at her funeral and realizing I was alone. Completely alone. No parents, no siblings, no family at all. Just me and a penthouse full of expensive furniture and a company that made money but didn't mean anything. He turned to look at them. That's why being here matters so much to me, why I keep coming back. You two are the closest thing to family I've had since I was a kid. Maybe the only real family I've ever had. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then he said, "My daddy used to tell me that blood makes you related but loyalty makes you family. You don't need the same last name or the same DNA to be kin. You just need to show up for each other when it matters." Your daddy was a smart man, Nathan said. He was, and he'd have liked you. Marcus smiled. Would have given you hell about those soft city hands, but he'd have liked you. They sat in silence for a while longer, and Nathan felt something settle in his chest, something that had been restless and searching for as long as he could remember. He'd spent 30 years trying to fill an empty place with achievement and money, when what he'd actually needed was this: a porch, a sunset, and people who chose to love him, not because of what he could give them, but because of who he was. It was almost too much to believe it was real. But real or not, Nathan was going to hold on to it for as long as they'd let him. As summer turned toward fall and Alicia's departure for Colombia drew closer, she began to pull away. It was subtle at first, taking longer to respond to Nathan's texts, being less available when he visited, disappearing into her room, earlier in the evenings. Marcus noticed but said nothing, assuming she was just dealing with the anxiety of leaving home. But Nathan noticed too, and it hurt more than he wanted to admit. He'd gotten used to Alicia being excited when he arrived, to her peppering him with questions about his work, and telling him about her college plans. He'd gotten used to mattering to someone, and the absence of that felt like a wound reopening. It came to a head 3 weeks before Alicia was scheduled to leave. Nathan had driven in on a Friday evening as usual, but instead of the warm welcome he'd come to expect, Alicia barely looked up from her textbook when he arrived. She excused herself after dinner, claiming she had to finish an assignment, and Nathan was left sitting on the porch with Marcus, trying not to show how much it stung.
"She's scared," Marcus said quietly, not looking at Nathan. "About leaving, about college, about all of it. I know, I just wish she'd talk to me about it. Give her time, she'll come around." But time passed and Alicia stayed distant, and Nathan's old anxieties began creeping back in. He'd let himself believe he was part of this family, but maybe he'd been fooling himself. Maybe they'd just been tolerating him out of gratitude, and now that Alicia was leaving, they didn't need him anymore. On a Tuesday afternoon, Nathan called Marcus to cancel his weekend visit, claiming work obligations. Marcus didn't push, just said he understood, but Nathan could hear the disappointment in his voice. That evening, Nathan sat in his penthouse staring at the city lights and feeling the familiar emptiness creeping back in. He'd been stupid to let himself get attached. People always left eventually, better to pull away now before the rejection became unbearable. His phone rang. "Marcus." "Hello, what's really going on, Nathan?" "I told you, work stuff. It's a busy time." "Bull. I've known you 6 months now. I know when you're running away from something." Nathan closed his eyes. "I'm not running." "Yes you are, and I think I know why. You think Alicia pulling away means we don't want you here anymore. She's been avoiding me for weeks, because she's scared she's just a replacement daughter for you." Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. "She's scared that you're only being nice to her because you lost your mama and she's filling that hole. She's scared that if she leaves for college you won't need her anymore, and this whole thing will fall apart." Nathan felt like he'd been punched. "That's not, I don't think of her as a replacement. I care about her because she's Alicia, not because she reminds me of anyone else. I know that, you know that, but she's 17 and about to leave home for the first time, and teenagers aren't always rational. She needs to hear it from you." After he hung up, Nathan sat for a long time thinking about what Marcus had said. Then he got in his car and started driving. He arrived at the farm at 11 o'clock at night, 3 hours after leaving Chicago. The lights were off except for a single lamp in Alicia's room. Nathan stood in the driveway for a moment, gathering his courage, then walked up to the porch and knocked softly. Marcus answered the door in his bathrobe, unsurprised. Thought you might be coming. Is she awake? She is. Go on up. Nathan climbed the stairs and knocked on Alicia's door. Can we talk? There was a long pause, then it's open. Alicia was sitting on her bed surrounded by textbooks and college information packets. She looked exhausted, and Nathan realized with a pang that she'd probably been losing sleep over this for weeks. Hi, he said from the doorway. Hi, can I come in? She nodded, and Nathan sat in the desk chair, keeping a respectful distance. Your dad told me you've been worried about us. About what happens when you leave. Alicia looked down at her hands. It's stupid. It's not stupid. Talk to me, please. She was quiet for a long moment, and then it all came pouring out. You lost your mom. Your family fell apart, and then you came here and found us, and we were broken too but still together. And I'm scared that I'm just convenient for you. That you're only being nice to me because I'm filling some hole left by your mother, and once I'm gone to college and I'm not around all the time, you'll realize you don't actually care about me, you just cared about having someone to be a daughter figure, and then you'll disappear, and Dad will be hurt, and everything will be ruined. She was crying now, the words tumbling out in a rush. Nathan felt his own throat tighten. Alicia, look at me. She raised her eyes and they were red and frightened and so young. I'm going to tell you something true, Nathan said. You're not a replacement, you're not filling a hole or being convenient or any of that. You're just you, smart and funny, and kind and more mature than I was at your age. I care about you because you're remarkable, not because you remind me of anyone else. My mother was, he paused, choosing his words carefully. She was a good person who had a hard life and didn't always handle it well. We loved each other, but our relationship was complicated, painful, sometimes. He leaned forward, needing her to understand. But with you, there's no complication, there's no pain, there's just you, being yourself, being brilliant and working hard and planning to change the world. And yes, being part of your family has helped heal something in me. But not because you're replacing someone, because you're showing me what family can be when it's healthy and real and built on actually caring about each other. But when you leave, I'm still going to come back here every other weekend to check on your dad and help with the farm and probably burn dinner more often than not. I'm still going to call you every Sunday to hear about your classes and your research and whatever adventure you're having in New York. And I'm going to be there for Thanksgiving and Christmas and spring break, if you want me there, because that's what family does. They don't stop being family just because someone goes to college. Alicia wiped her eyes. You promise? I promise. You're stuck with me now. I don't care if you go to New York or Tokyo or Mars. You're my family. That doesn't change. She lunged across the bed and hugged him, and Nathan held her while she cried, relief mixed with fear, mixed with the complicated emotions of growing up and leaving home. After a while her breathing evened out and she pulled back, managing a watery smile. I'm sorry I've been weird. You haven't been weird, you've been scared. That's normal. Dad's going to be so lonely when I leave. Your dad's going to be fine. He's got the farm, and the community, and me making sure he doesn't work himself to death. You focus on school, we'll hold down the fort here. Alicia nodded, then said quietly, thank you, for coming tonight, for saying all that, for being, she trailed off, searching for the word. Family? Nathan supplied, yeah, for being family. The day Alicia left for Columbia, Nathan drove the two of them to the train station in Wichita. Marcus sat in the back seat, uncharacteristically quiet, and Alicia rode shotgun with her headphones on, staring out the window at the Kansas countryside rolling past. Nathan understood both of them. He understood Marcus's fear of being alone, of watching his daughter step into a world he couldn't protect her from. And he understood Alicia's mixture of excitement and terror, the knowledge that everything was about to change and you could never go back to the simplicity of before. What he didn't fully understand until they pulled up to the train station was that this moment was healing something in him too. The last time Nathan had watched someone he loved leave on a train, he was 10 years old and his mother was sending him to boarding school for the first time.
She'd been crying but trying to hide it, and Nathan had been angry and confused, feeling abandoned even though she'd explained it was for the best, that she couldn't afford proper after-school care while she worked, and the boarding school offered scholarships. He'd watched her get smaller and smaller through the train window, and he'd felt something crack inside him, some fundamental trust that the people who loved you would stay. Now he was 30 years old, standing on a different platform in a different state, helping Alicia with her luggage while Marcus hovered nearby trying to be helpful but mostly just getting in the way. And instead of that old crack opening wider, Nathan felt something shifting, some rewriting of the narrative that said leaving always meant abandoning. They checked Alicia's bags and stood on the platform waiting for the boarding call. Marcus kept touching Alicia's shoulder, her arm, her hand, like he needed to maintain physical contact for as long as possible. Alicia tolerated it with good grace, occasionally rolling her eyes but mostly just letting her father have his moment. "You have your phone charger?" Marcus asked for the third time. "Yes, Dad, and you've got Dr. Patterson's number in case you need a prescription transferred." "Yes, Dad, and you know you can call any time, day or night, if you need anything." "Dad." Alicia took his hand. "I know, it's going to be okay. We're going to be okay." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. The boarding call came over the loudspeaker. This was it. Alicia turned to Nathan first, and there was something significant in that choice, something that said he wasn't an afterthought, or an add-on, but an actual part of this family moment. She hugged him tight. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for saving Dad's farm, for being here, for being you. Thank you for letting me be part of your family." Nathan whispered back, "Go change the world, kid." She pulled back, grinning through tears. "I'll try." Then she turned to Marcus, and Nathan took a step back to give them privacy. Marcus pulled his daughter into a long hug, and Nathan could see his shoulders shaking even though he was trying to stay strong. "I love you so much," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "Your mama would be so proud." "I love you too, Dad. Take care of yourself. And make sure Nathan actually eats vegetables when you cook." Marcus laughed, a choked sound. "I will." One more hug, and then Alicia was picking up her carry-on bag and walking toward the train. She turned at the door to wave one more time, and then she was gone, swallowed up by the crowd of other students and travelers. Marcus and Nathan stood on the platform watching the train pull away. Marcus's hand was clenched tight around the platform railing, his knuckles pale. Nathan stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and felt tears running down his own face. This was what it looked like when people left with love instead of anger, when departure was about growth instead of abandonment, when someone could leave knowing they could always come back because home wasn't a place. It was people who would hold space for you no matter how far you traveled. "She's going to do great things," Nathan said quietly. Marcus nodded. "She is." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Thank you for being here. I don't think I could have done this alone." "You're not alone," Nathan said. "Not anymore." They stood there until the train was completely out of sight, and then they walked back to the car together. Marcus climbed into the passenger seat this time without being asked, and Nathan drove them home, both of them quiet with their own thoughts. Halfway back to the farm, Marcus said, "You know what the hardest part is?" "What?" "Knowing she doesn't need me anymore. Not the way she used to. She's grown up, she's ready for the world, and that's exactly what I wanted, what her mama and I worked for, but God, it hurts." "She still needs you," Nathan said, "just in different ways, and she'll always need you. Parents don't become obsolete just because their kids grow up." Marcus looked at him. "You'd have made a good father." Nathan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Maybe, I'd like to think so. It's not too late, you know. You're only 30, you could still have kids of your own someday." "Maybe." But Nathan wasn't sure he wanted that anymore. What he wanted he'd already found, this complicated patched-together family that had chosen each other instead of being bound by blood. Alicia and Marcus had given him something he'd been missing his whole life, and he wasn't about to waste time wishing for some hypothetical different version when what he had was already perfect. They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and when they pulled up to the farmhouse, Marcus didn't immediately get out. He sat there looking at his home, and Nathan knew he was seeing how empty it was about to feel. "Come on," Nathan said. "Let's go inside. I'll make dinner." "You'll burn dinner, you mean?" "Probably. But at least we won't be alone while I do it." Marcus smiled, Small but genuine. No, at least there's that. 1 year later, Nathan stood in the middle of Marcus Hill's cornfield on an October afternoon, watching the harvest crew work. The farm had grown significantly over the past year. Marcus had leased 2 additional adjacent properties and expanded his operation with Nathan's quiet financial backing. What had been a struggling 20-hectare farm was now a thriving regional operation that employed 3 full-time workers and provided seasonal work for a dozen more. But the real harvest, Nathan thought, wasn't measured in bushels of corn. His phone rang, Alicia right on schedule. They'd fallen into a routine of Sunday afternoon calls where she'd update him on her classes and research while he told her about the farm and Marcus's latest projects. "Hey kid, how's the brilliant college sophomore?" "Exhausted," she said, but she sounded happy. "I just finished a presentation for my biomedical engineering class. We're designing a low-cost prosthetic arm prototype. It's so cool, Nathan. We're using—" She launched into a detailed technical explanation that Nathan mostly didn't follow but loved hearing anyway. "That's amazing. Your dad's going to be so proud." "Is he there? Can I talk to him?" "He's in the barn." "Hang on." Nathan walked across the field, watching Marcus direct the harvest crew with easy authority. Over the past year, Marcus had transformed from a man barely hanging on to someone confident in his own success. He'd started mentoring young farmers in the area, sharing the techniques that Nathan's investment had allowed him to learn. He'd become a respected voice in the local agricultural community, but more importantly, he'd become Nathan's best friend. "Your daughter's on the phone," Nathan called out. Marcus grinned and jogged over, taking the phone. "Hey baby girl, how's school?" Nathan walked away to give them privacy, but he could hear Marcus's laughter, could see the way his whole face lit up when he talked to Alicia. She'd been home for Thanksgiving and summer break, and she'd return for Christmas in a few months. She was thriving at Columbia, had already connected with a research lab that wanted her as an assistant for next year. She was going to be fine, better than fine. She was going to change the world, just like she'd always planned. Marcus finished the call and handed the phone back. "She sounds good. She is good. You did well, Marcus. We did well." Marcus gestured at the field, the barn, the farmhouse in the distance. "All of this. It's not just me, it's you too. It's us." Nathan felt that familiar warmth in his chest, the feeling that had become so common over the past year that he almost took it for granted now. Belonging. Being part of something that mattered. "You got any plans for Thanksgiving?" Marcus asked. "Because Alicia's bringing her roommate home with her, the girl from California, who's never had real Thanksgiving dinner, and I figured we'd do it up right. Turkey, all the sides, the whole thing. You should come. Hell, you should stay for the whole weekend. Help me make sure Alicia doesn't spend the entire break buried in textbooks." "I'd love that," Nathan said. They walked back toward the house as the sun started to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Nathan thought about his penthouse in Chicago, sitting empty except for the twice-weekly cleaning service, and realized he hadn't been there in nearly 3 weeks. He'd been spending most weekends here, and several weekdays too, working remotely and helping Marcus with the farm. This place had become home in a way Chicago never had. "Marcus," Nathan said as they reached the porch, "I've been thinking about something." "Yeah, what if I moved here? Not full-time necessarily, but what if I bought that property down the road, the one with the old house that just came on the market, fixed it up, made it my primary residence instead of keeping that penthouse in the city?" Marcus stopped walking. "You'd do that? Leave Chicago?" "Chicago was never really home. This is, you and Alicia, this farm, this place, this is where I want to be." Marcus's eyes were bright. "Well then, I guess you'd better make an offer on that property." Yeah. Can't have family living halfway across the country when they could be right down the road." They sat on the porch as the sun finished setting, watching the lights come on in the barn, and the last of the harvest crew packing up for the day. Somewhere in New York, Alicia was probably studying for her next exam, brilliant and driven in everything her mother had hoped she'd become. Somewhere in the past, Nathan's younger self was standing alone at his mother's funeral, believing he'd always be alone. But here, now, in the present that had somehow become better than anything he could have imagined, Nathan Cole sat beside Marcus Hill, part of a family he'd chosen and that had chosen him back, and felt more at home than he'd ever felt in his life. You know what I think, Marcus said into the comfortable silence. What? I think that car crashing into my field was the best thing that ever happened to both of us. Nathan smiled. Yeah, I think you might be right. They sat there as the stars came out, two men who'd saved each other's lives in ways that went beyond burning cars and mortgage payments. They'd given each other something more precious than money, or crops or land. They'd given each other family. And family, Nathan had finally learned, wasn't something you were born into. It was something you built, one day at a time, with people who chose to show up for you even when they didn't have to. People who saw you at your worst and decided to love you anyway. People who made space for you at their table and in their hearts, and never made you feel like you had to earn the right to belong. The corn rustled in the evening breeze, and somewhere far away a train carried other people toward their own futures, and Marcus and Nathan sat together in the home they'd both found when they'd stopped looking for it. Family, finally, at last.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.